Welcome to another episode of the Mangxiety Show, a show dedicated to helping men solve their problems, solve our problems in relationships, love, sex, and in money. These are the topics that most couples argue about. And in this quest of making my mess my message, this new conversation has been emerging in my Cycle Breakers Academy, and I really wanted to include you in on the conversation because it's probably the most important conversation that we can have if we are interested in having relationships that feel safe, relationships that are secure, where codependency isn't running the show, where you're not constantly in fear of, is this person cheating on me, leaving me? Do they love me? The constant needing validation, or the fear of engulfment, the fear of commitment, the fear of responsibility, which was my end of the spectrum. And so my mess in my relationship game has now become my message, and very relevantly tied into my training. I'm not a clinical psychologist, psychotherapist, psychiatrist. I'm not a psychiatric scholar. However, I am a trained chiropractor and have come up with a really neat tool to help clear emotional stress unwittingly, because my mess was my message. This whole journey began with my relationship with anxiety itself. I started this work because I didn't know how to manage anxiety, and meeting my good friend, Dr. Russell Kennedy, who's also a contributor in this podcast, he really taught me that anxiety is not a mental cognitive issue. I was a master at cognitive work, Dr. John DeMartini's facilitator, Byron Katie School of the Work, Joe Dispenza, like you kind of think about it, you imagine it, and I've studied it to try to help me resolve this anxiety issue. When I met Dr. Russ, it made it click for me. And I was like, so make sure, if you haven't gotten his book, The Anxiety RX, make sure you get it. Brilliant book. And so that started me off on my journey. And I realized that I was operating relationships after I kind of delved into the somatic type of work, going past the cognitive. I realized, holy shit, I have been operating in relationships as an avoidant. I was insecurely attached. And in the journey of understanding this, because all I cared about was like, holy shit, I'm 43 years old. I'm going to die never having experienced love that feels secure. I was divorced once, one failed relationship after another, where I was the avoidant, desperately seeking connection. But then soon as it happened, responsibility showed up. I wanted to fucking run the other way. And this push-pull dynamic, which I couldn't understand, but every relationship I went through was the same thing. It took me to my last relationship, which woke me up. It was an abusive relationship. Like, I've been divorced, so we said some nasty things to one another during the ending, although we're really good friends now. Me and my ex-wife, more than 10 years ago, divorced, but one relationship after another, the last one became so toxic that the police were involved, that there was this drama triangle of perpetrator, victim, rescuer. We were both each other's rescuers that turned into this, what I didn't know at the time, trauma bond. And so it became really important to me to figure out, my mess, which was this concept of reactivity. I could have all of the cognitive awareness, but the more that she would push for a contract, for money, for some sort of guarantee, some sort of ring, using manipulation tactics, I didn't have the ability to set boundaries. And the way that I did, they were just trampled over. And that was just the pattern. I wasn't raised understanding boundaries. So I was just used to having them trampled over, and that caused the reactivity. And so reactively, we would become abusive to one another. And we were really struggling with this for a while. We were like, let's get to the bottom of it. And none of our cognitive tools actually worked. So finally, really after meeting Dr. Russ, I delved into a completely different direction. I stopped using cognition. I stopped trying to figure out how to get rid of how I'm feeling. And I realized that I was living with a nervous system that was completely dysregulated, that I was basically operating from an insecure place because of unresolved anxiety. And I had to get to the bottom of it. And that was the journey of becoming trigger proof, not trigger less, but I understood. I wanted to really figure out, as smart as you can be, the moment that you get triggered, in that moment of activation, 3/4 of your brain shuts down. So I've worked with 7-figure coaches who are 7-figure, like amazing powerhouse boss babes. Soon as they get triggered, they become volatile, anxious little teenagers or 3-year-olds. And that's how they show up in relationships, unable to attract masculine men. They're always in the lead because anxiety, unresolved anxiety, these traumas that live in our system cause us to pull towards those familiar patterns, trauma bonding. So we bond from our traumas, and then we create these cycles of codependency, love bombing, and devaluing, discarding, and the push-pull dynamic. We don't know how to rupture, have argument and conflict, and none of us were given the tools and skills in how to repair. And this lack of repair, activated little system, pretend like you're a child and your parents just yelled and screamed at you, and all of a sudden you have this activation and you're left by yourself without an empathetic witness. So you in that moment don't know what to do except to draw a conclusion about these sensations in your body that it's because you're bad inside. You're a bad kid. You are wrong because you can't see, your parents are infallible. We can't see our parents as flawed because we'd rather be the sinner in their kind of like goodness instead of us being the good one living in an unsafe environment. So we reflexively, protectively draw the conclusion as children that we're inherently bad. And then we enter relationships with this wounding. And so what I realized was that was how I was operating in my relationships. And it wasn't bad. It's nothing shameful. It's not. And I was so ashamed of it. And I realized I didn't have to be ashamed once I understood what a trauma bond was. Once I said, I really want to become trigger proof and I want to show up differently. I want to attract a different type of person. I want to be attracted to a different type of person. Really, based on my wounding, I needed to be with the wounded bird so I could rescue her, while at the same time, because of my unhealed wounds, needing rescuing as well, because I was basically operating with crippling self-esteem issues. That's the challenge, because my business, when I left chiropractic, things became really big really quickly, and it expanded beyond my emotional capacity. My business grew faster than my emotional maturity would be able to contain. And we all know the world is full of people who grow extremely fast. If you're an entrepreneur, you will understand if you grow very fast in impact and influence, and it's beyond your emotional capacity, your emotional maturity, you will find a way to sabotage it. And so my last relationship was the form of sabotage, which I put in air quotes when I use that word, because it's not a very trauma-informed language, because truthfully, we're never sabotaging ourselves. We just are growing too big to what we truly feel we deserve. And so we'll find a way to burn that fucker down. There's a shadow inside of all of us that is always whispering, you're not that good. You're not good. You're inherently bad. And so just like my unresolved wounding, that inner child shadow part of me that I hadn't really looked at because I was too busy using personal development to try to, override it and pretend it wasn't there. Basically, there was a huge blow up in my last relationship. So it became really important for me to understand Number one, how do I make sure it never happens again? I don't want to attract a person like that. I don't want to be attracted to that. I don't want to be the hero rescuer. I don't want to be rescued. I want a healthy, secure relationship. What does that even look like? I had to research it. This is why we talk about this in our academy. You know, most people, if you ask them, what does a secure relationship actually feel like? They're like, I have no idea. It's like, okay, we need to study what that is so that we can go from what we don't know to that becoming a new reality. That was my number one goal. I don't care whatever distance I have to travel, whatever price I have to pay. I have to find the right guides because I don't want to die not having felt secure love. What good is all the money in the world what good is this massive homes, like what Shaquille O'Neal said? He goes, I had like $20 million house. I had like 18, 20 rooms or whatever. And I was sitting there all alone, no family. And I was like, that was me. That was going to be me. I was 43 years old. So I started studying the practice, the discipline of becoming trigger proof. And that's the same path of healing from our relational anxieties. And this is the same path as becoming a cycle breaker. So essentially, you have to become a cycle breaker. So all of this 10-minute rant, just to kind of set you up for the conversation today, and I have my notes here. Basically, it is really about how mom and dad unknowingly impacted your relationships. So these are 7 parenting triggers, unconscious parenting triggers that create anxiety in our relationships. And this isn't a podcast episode to blame mommy and daddy. This isn't about blame. This is about what you experienced, right? And so the reason why many people avoid this is because they feel guilt, because they think that they're blaming mom and dad. But we're not blaming mom and dad because they had no idea. If mom and dad were listening to this, they'd be like, holy shit, I experienced these 7 triggers, which I'm about to share. So what you get then is a big picture overview that it's just a cycle going into your system. And unknowingly, you might notice some of these patterns going to your next generation, your kids. And so if you're a parent and you're listening, I have something really important for you. If you are really concerned about upping your parenting game, and this is the first time I'm talking about it from terms of parenting, because I'm 48 years old and I have a 3-year-old. So I didn't feel that I had anything to say as far as parenting goes. We were just focusing on healing intergenerational trauma from our past. But then it's like, we can't have that conversation about intergenerational healing without talking about how we parent our children. So I'm going to talk about that. And so if you're a parent, I want you to listen from the perspective of a parent as well as the child. So you have a really unique perspective. So this is really about how your parents, your mom and dad, unknowingly set you up to have trauma bonded situations. So there's 7 of them. The first one is when a parent overvalues. By the way, I have my notes here, and this is basically from studying scholars in psychology. I just researched the shit out of it, and I had to embody this work. And so I'm going to share with you some of the things that I saw that were helpful, that helped me make sense of my childhood, number one. And here's the bonus for parents. You can actually break the cycle and not raise your kids this way. Okay, so here it is. Number one is overvaluation. This is where, the parent has had extreme low self-esteem, does not want the child to have low self-esteem. So they praise often without merit. This is giving the ribbon to everybody type of scenario. And what happens is it creates an unrealistic self-image, kind of like an entitlement, so to speak. And when that child who's been overvalued, not really being honest, doesn't mean you have to be like Simon Cowell to the kid, but when that kid didn't receive kind of like an honest valuation and was overvalued and created entitlement in adulthood, in teenage years, in adulthood, when the world pushes back and doesn't validate exactly what the expectation, the entitlement was, this creates massive anxiety in the child, which will create this sense of false sense, which also the child then becomes kind of narcissistic. So if you're with a partner, or you can kind of see those traits within you, this anxiousness comes from being overvalued as a parent. Now, what I want you to get is parenting is really difficult, I'm finding, because trauma, here's what being a trauma-informed parent is like, trauma is what happens when we have it's too much, too soon, or not enough for a prolonged period of time. So if we get too much, we get fucked up. If we get not enough, we get fucked up. So it's like this really kind of happy medium that we're going for, because the extremes, anything on the extreme that we receive from our parents, too much validation or not enough, basically creates dysfunction. It's that balance in the middle, isn't this, the duality of life? It's that balance of the middle that really helps us form secure, healthy bonds with ourselves, create a healthy sense of self-worth, and we have good mental health, right? That's the first one. So overvaluation, excessive praise, often without merit. Number two, overvaluation. Remember, what's the other side? Underestimation, where there's an undervaluing or basically ignoring the achievements of the child. If your parents did not at all recognize, because maybe they have a story about it, they don't want to spoil you, so they withhold their acknowledgement of you, right? And what happens then is this creates this sense of like, what the fuck? Like, am I not good enough? This constant feeling of I'm not good enough. If you've been noticing these thought patterns constantly, I'm not good enough, not good enough, you've probably had a little bit of that. And so what happens is if you notice, as a result of your parents undervaluing, you are now constantly seeking external validation, which creates anxiety when you don't have it, because you're looking for a sense of self-worth outside of you, which is basically self-abandonment. And then we show up as insecure in our relationships. And unknowingly, we then pass that on to children. And because we mean well, it's like, I don't want to spoil my kid. My parent overvalued me, so I'm going to undervalue, right? So you see how we flip it, right? Because we haven't resolved our shit. We haven't come to a completion with it. So we're going to adapt and try to teach our kids, and we're going to do it the exact opposite. Unknowingly, we're sending them to the other end of the spectrum. And it all impacts our sense of self-worth. And this is where anxiety comes in. Okay, relational anxiety, insecure attachment, not feeling like you're worthy of anything, constantly needing external validation. And when you get it, it's not enough, right? And how does this show up in your relationship? If you're in a relationship with someone and that person says, I can't win with you, chances are there's a blind spot here. This is one of them. I can't win with you, right? Doesn't it count? Doesn't it count, right? Doesn't what I'm doing count? These are what your partner will say when you're activated through this anxiety, all caused by that rupture. See how we're talking cyclical, and then we pass it on to the kids, to the next generation. Type in the chat. Let me know if this is landing for you. Is this resonating? Number three way that mom and dad created anxiety in relationships, and how they impact your relationships, is when they show a lack of genuine empathy. For years, I didn't have the experience of my parents reflecting or validating my experience, my feelings, right? My parents lack empathy, and it's not because they're bad people, it's because they're at the effect of their wounding. And when they have a lack of empathy, which is basically our narcissistic parts all lack empathy. When you're raised without having your internal experience validated, in fact, saying you shouldn't be feeling that way, this lack of genuine empathy causes us to then not be able to have empathy. How can we, right? Because we then feel like we are inherently bad. And then we then go looking for validation outside of us. I need to know how you feel so that I know how I feel. This is enmeshment, right? We abandon ourselves because, we then feel that we are inherently bad, and we then lose trust in our own feelings. Should I feel that way? Here's what it looks like. Like, I need your opinion. I don't trust how I feel. Like, should I feel this way? Like, am I wrong for feeling this way? This is relational anxiety. This is how we show up insecure in relationship, caused by parents who don't really have the capacity to be with their emotions, which then passes down to us. Notice how I'm not blaming your parents. How could they know? Are they like amazing violinists? No. How could they? They never learned. They never took the classes. They never did the deep work, unless you have unicorn parents. So then this lack of genuine empathy, this underestimation, this overvaluation, these start from mom and dad. These create a rupture within ourselves. And now we show up insecure in relationships. And because of that codependency and that lack of attunement, our kids end up unknowingly feeling the same way. And then it passes down to the next generation. And so luckily we can stop it. Once you learn what's happening here, you're able to recognize the signs. You become trigger proof. You now know exactly how to expand that space between stimulus and response and repair with your kid. You break the cycle from them having the same experience. Even though you're a well-meaning parent, it will spill over. Number 4. This is number 4 way your parents impacted your relationships. Their emotional inconsistency, right? So if the child basically is not feeling loved just for who they are, they have to work for it, or that you receiving love from mom and dad was conditional. Tell me if this lands or resonates for you. It was conditional that you performed, that you did something, and you got somewhere, or you behaved a certain way, and it was withdrawn or it was inconsistent when you weren't doing it. What happens is you then learn, like, you have to put on a mask. You have to put on a performance. You have to perform to be loved. Hello, fawning. So if you show up in relationships and you notice yourself fawning, or you're noticing your children fawning, red flag is that the child, we'll just say the child, whether it's your kid or you, the kid, is raised with emotional inconsistency. This creates a trauma bond, because then you become the narcissist codependent in that trauma bond cycle. You either become the narcissist or the codependent. You're probably dating somebody or married to somebody who's like, oh my gosh, this is them. Well, if their parents gave them emotional inconsistency, they're going to show up in a push-pull dynamic. And now if you haven't dealt with it, guess what? You pass it along to the kid. This is really important. I have a 3-year-old. I'll be damned if Dominic has a relationship the way I had my last one. Wow, talk about ignoring red flags. I trampled over my red flags. Red flags. She was a high-end escort and stripper, and kind of maybe a little bit creative with creating diagnoses. Like, I was diagnosed celiac. It was a red flag. I'm like, did you get a blood test? Did you get a biopsy? No, I didn't. A doctor diagnosed me. I'm like, well, then you don't have celiac. You probably have food sensitivities. Oh, no, I was diagnosed celiac. It was like an identity of illness. And that was a red flag that I completely trampled over, because I know that people who identify, this is part of my training, this is how I help people heal from chronic illness, from PTSD, all this shit, you can actually overcome it. Google or YouTube Dr. Nima Ramani PTSD, and you will be able to see a video of me helping people, 22 years PTSD, simply by shifting the identity. They didn't have the illness anymore. Things like PTSD, those are heavily, it's not all in your head. I'm saying it's an identity that actually can be overridden when you have the incentive to get past it. And so those were two major red flags that I totally just kind of like blew past and thought it would be a great idea to have her run my company. And as we were going through this beautiful toxic trauma bond, push-pull dynamic, where I was using her for sex and services, and she was using me for money, obviously for credibility, because she wanted to get out of that kind of dark netherworld and have some sort of a legitimate kind of enterprise, because every other business other than her sex working business, she would basically fail in. So there was this symbiotic co-rescuing operation, which is critical for a trauma bond to occur. Boom, I found myself in a position where I got caught. I was like, oh shit, how do I get out of here? And because things had already in our past, we've had some incidents where I slapped her. There was 2 incidences where it was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, what happened? Right? And those were constantly like brought up in our dynamic. And it was like waving in my face, like, I'm going to call the police. I was like, oh my gosh, if I leave this woman, a lot of trauma bonds, the reason why I'm saying this is a lot of people are stuck in relational dynamics because they're afraid to leave. They're afraid of the consequences. Women, they're afraid of the consequences of leaving because he's going to abuse her. You know, he could kill her, whatever it is, because of his abandonment wound. Well, my ex's abandonment wounds, I was afraid that triggering her abandonment wound, she was going to create a smear campaign. So basically, the abuse becomes reputational. Different for women. For women, the fear is physical. For men, the fear is reputational, right? And I knew that she had that, and she basically hung it, right? And I was like, oh shit, how do I get out of this? So the reason why I'm sharing this is there is no way that Dominic will ever find himself in that situation. I am committed to making sure that, and by the way, I'm not saying that I was blameless in it, by the way. This is a full accountability, full responsibility for my part in the dynamic, and the fact that I'm a victim, I'm a perpetrator, I'm a rescuer. This all started generations ago for both of us, right? So this is a generational conversation. So emotional inconsistency, lack of genuine empathy. I was raised with those. In fact, if you're watching this and you're Persian, you're East Indian, you're Chinese, I guarantee you have all of the above, because it's in our culture, in Asian cultures, Middle Eastern, Asian cultures, empathy is just, there isn't a word for it. You know, my mom, you know, as I was in my healing journey and just kind of like in that phase where I was blaming them, and my healing journey, in the beginning, a lot of these emotions were coming up, and anger, and it's a really painful process to heal from trauma bonds. We got to go into the past and really resurface all of these narratives that are stuck in our nervous system. And as they were coming out, I was just full of anger and rage for the needs that the little child inside of me didn't receive. And there was a lot of kind of integrity conversations and repair conversations with my parents. And our relationship is better now than it's ever been. But there was a lot of rage. And I was like, you guys are narcissistic parents, right? I was so angry with them. And I was single at the time. I moved back in with them, and my mom kind of like has this, as I was just going inward, my mom was watching me, and she was like, you know, having her emotions about it too, her guilt and shame, she was just trying to avoid. She then goes and starts taking classes with my dad on empathy. And so my mom comes in one day. It's one of my favorite stories. She comes in from her empathy class that she just did, one class, $20, hosted by a Persian psychologist on empathy. And my mom comes in and goes, Nima, empathy is so hard. And I'm like, yeah, I know. It's really hard for you guys. I know. And me too. I didn't learn it. I didn't learn it from you guys. And she goes, you're supposed to say it must feel like before you talk to somebody and you're talking to them. And I'm like, Interesting. I've never heard those words from you, Mom. I've never heard it must feel like from you. And I realized, wow, this lack of genuine empathy, this emotional inconsistency, which wasn't their fault. They didn't receive, right? And so that's the parent. That's how our mom and dad impacted our relationships. Notice how we can have the conversation, how they impacted the relationship without using fault and blame, with compassion. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in throwing the words fault and blame out the window and really just having a compassionate, adult, mature conversation. This is what being a cycle breaker really is all about. This is the only people that I'm willing to talk to. Those that just are tired of feeling like victims. You feel like the victim, you're tired of feeling like the victim, and you're willing to kind of expand your perspective so that you can see beyond your own victim narrative and victim story. That was the only way, because I was feeling victimized by my ex, feeling victimized by my parents. And so I had to kind of grow up. And that's really what emergence and the healing journey is about, is becoming our functional adult higher selves. It's a spiritual journey. So that was number 4, was emotional inconsistency. Number 5 way that mom and dad are unknowingly, unwittingly impacting your relationships, which then you are passing on to your kids. Here's the duality: either extreme permissiveness, do whatever the fuck you want. Yeah, sure. Yes, 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 yes. Have this toy. Yes, spoiling them. Or the other side, excessive control. There's that happy medium conversation. Like nobody really gave us the manual. Nobody gave your parents the manual. They might read some books, but reading books is not enough. We actually have to heal from as an immersion. We have to immerse ourselves into the somatics, into healing at a nervous system level. We can't expect our children to be able to be regulating themselves if we don't know how to regulate ourselves. How can my parents expect me to behave, to calm down, to not have big fits and tantrums and act out if they themselves do not know how to regulate their big sensations that come up? Parenting brings up a lot of your shit. Do you know how to be with it? My parents really didn't. So what happens is the child then feels alone. And in that aloneness, not knowing how to regulate ourselves, in a timeout, in a withdrawing, because our parents feel victimized by us, and parenting is tough. They don't know what to do with their emotions. We end up feeling alone to regulate ourselves. And the way that we wire it is we create stories. And that story is, I'm not good enough. And that's the focus of our inadequacy and our insecurity. And then we go into relationships with that in our body, in our core. We feel we don't deserve, so we don't receive. Or we have to be hyper controlling to control the situation and rescue, just like our parents. We had to rescue them to feel safe because of their addictions, or we had to please them or put on a mask. This is where our insecurities come from. Our parents unknowingly doing it to us, and then we doing it to our children. Not because we're bad parents, but because we haven't yet learned how to become trigger proof. We haven't learned how to expand that space between stimulus and response. We haven't learned how to hold space and validate a kid's emotions and learn how to work with them and to repair with them. And so that we're not needing their validation. Our job is not to make them happy. Our job is to actually keep them safe. And sometimes that means setting boundaries and saying no, which then causes them to say things like my son says, I don't love you. If that triggers my abandonment wound, I might be overly permissive and say, okay, you can have whatever you want. Or that'll trigger an abandonment wound and say, then I'll become hyper controlling. You're not allowed to ever say that, or else you'll get a timeout. All because I'm triggered and my childhood wounding is triggered. I'm making the child's outburst or whatever about me. And that's what your parents unknowingly did. But you don't have to do that. If you're a parent, you don't have to do that to your child. You can break that cycle. And number 6 way that mom and dad unknowingly impact our relationships is viewing the child as an extension of themselves. Think about that. This is where the parent imposes the unfulfilled fantasies of their lives. A great example of this is watching the Tiger Woods documentary with his dad. Woo! You know, Tiger Woods' unfulfilled dreams, imposes it on the child. This child then grows up with this issue with sex, right? Anxiety. I watched it, and Tiger Woods is like this disconnected kid who basically has to perform and be the best. And the dad was a raving narcissist, right? So you can see how Tiger's relationships have been, right? Wow. We all know about that. It's not because he's a bad person. It's not his dad's fault either. It's the dynamic that created it. When you have a lens of the polyvagal theory, a polyvagal lens, a somatic lens, everything makes sense. Human behavior is very predictable. So we can really make sense of it so that we can then choose a different outcome. That's how I was now able to be in a secure relationship. I figured all of this out. The work lives in my bones. I stopped being a chiropractor. I let go of my practice and I said, shit, my mess is my message. I gotta, first of all, learn how to do this. I stopped taking care of anybody else and I just made this my priority. Learning this because I wanted to have a secure relationship. I didn't imagine that I would be a dad, but when Diana said that we're gonna be parents, I was like, I'm all in. And now that Dominic in the recording of this is 3 years old, I can honestly say it's probably the best outcomes that I've ever didn't imagine from my own inner work is how amazing that we can create an experience for our children once we heal ourselves. Wow, this kid is just open with the world, complete safety. His emotional needs are met. My job is to create a secure bond with his mother so that mom can pour all of her heart and soul into him and he gets emotionally nourished. My relationship with her is amazing. He is resilient. He has empathy. Everybody who, you know, when the first week of preschool is kind of like a brag. Oh my gosh, is he going to be anxious? Most kids are crying. He was like, no, I'm okay. It was me and his mother. It was his mother that was crying on his first day of preschool. It wasn't him. He was like, oh, cool, let's do this. So what happens when you have a secure child? What happens when a child gets all their emotional needs met? When the parent really takes on the work and gets all their emotional needs met, the child then becomes secure. It's like, hey, I don't need other people. I can just be present in the interaction, which is what a secure relationship is. This is what's available to you. If you don't have a secure relationship, which is probably one of the reasons why the algorithms have put you're in the universe of insecure relational dynamics, trauma bond. It's because of these parenting blunders that your parents didn't know about. But you don't have to make the same mistake. This is the good news, is that we now have the information. If you just are willing to get past the excuses and really look at yourself instead of just blaming your problem kid, throwing them in front of a child psychologist and giving them the diagnoses. Oh, they have ADHD and they have this. And I'm not saying that they don't have, you know, some challenges and behavioral issues. I'm saying parents are our egos, because of our unresolved wounding with our parents, stop us from taking on the work because we don't want to feel like bad parents. You're not a bad parent if you actually are committed to breaking the cycle for your kids. If you're interested in even being in the conversation, you're an amazing parent, because parenting is not about being perfect. I'm not a perfect parent. However, I am 100% willing to repair with my son, which is all he needs. He doesn't need a perfect dad. He needs a dad who understands and is able to regulate his emotions and be willing to repair with him. That's what's going to create a secure bond, not perfection. In fact, getting into conflict with him and then repairing actually sets him up beautifully for a beautiful existence, which is why I'm so keen on teaching my cycle breakers these principles. The last one, So yeah, the number 6, viewing the child as an extension of themselves, basically trying to impose their unfulfilled aspirations, their ego. It's an extension. This kid is an extension of my ego. What happens is the child then isn't seen for who they are. They're utilitarian. They're like a means to get it's kind of like the child becomes a tool for the parents receiving their narcissistic supply. Tell me if that lands for you. Were you used? Did you feel like you were being used as the display so that they could get the validation? Kind of like that's when they view the child as an extension of themselves. And this is what causes us to have self-doubt, lack of self-trust, low self-worth. This is exactly what happens. And then we're passing that on to our kids. And number 7, the final one that I wanted to share, emotional neglect. Emotional neglect. Basically, not having a parent, tell me if this lands, not having your parent understand or even have the capacity to validate your experience. Your big emotions all of a sudden cause them to become dysregulated. And now, as the child, you have to be like calming the parent down. You have to abandon yourself to then look after the emotional needs of your parent because they didn't have the tools to regulate. So you're neglected. It's called emotional neglect, but you have to abandon yourself in order to get love. So then what happens when we have emotional neglect? We overcompensate by creating a sense of grandiosity. I need for everybody to be seeing me. It creates narcissism, which is quite challenging. Or the exact opposite, codependency, borderline, where you're constantly seeking your own sense of worth by merging with somebody else, enmeshing with somebody else. Both of the spectrum becomes needy for external validation. The narcissist wants it from the many. The codependent just needs it from the one. And the codependent mother, take a look, your parents, if they had a codependent kind of trauma bonded situation, the codependent mother becomes the narcissistic. The codependent wife becomes the narcissistic mother. Think about it. This is one of the patterns that I see a lot of in codependency. In our programs, even this is a real shocker to many of the people who are doing the work, is that they identify as codependent and then they realize, oh my gosh, I was the narcissistic mother because I was just obsessed with the trauma bonded situation, which then causes the children to feel neglected emotionally. And it's nobody's fault. This is not a blame or shame game. So there's 7 ways your parents impacted the way your relationships are going. Number 1, through overvaluation. Number 2, through underestimation. Number 3, lacking genuine empathy for you. Number 4, emotional inconsistency. It was like conditional upon you performing or being a certain way. Number 5, extreme permissiveness. Yes, do what you want. You're amazing. Overvaluation and permissiveness, causing you to become entitled, little Kanye West, which you're going to have quite a bit of problem when you see that the world doesn't fucking revolve around you, Kanye. Oh boy. Or excessive control, which is micromanaging, and then you lose trust in yourself and you're constantly looking outside of you for your worth, right? The codependent, needing that authority, So fawning, inconsistency, extreme permissiveness and control. Number 6, when they view the child as an extension of themselves, of their own ego. And number 7, emotional neglect. That's it. There's many more. I mean, everything, most of the traumas that we go through are a variation of that. And trauma isn't about the event. Emotional neglect isn't like physical violence. That's like one event, right? Emotional neglect, it's not about the event. It's what's happening inside of us without a resolution, without an empathetic witness. And so unwittingly, our cycle breakers, as they start the work and they're healing with their younger parts and creating secure attachments, they're realizing that they've unwittingly passed that along to their kids. So if you're a parent and this is something you're really keen on learning more about, I'm doing a workshop that's coming up next couple weeks. I'm leaving a link there. It's called Connecting to the Anxious Child. Support your kid's emotional health by becoming a polyvagal parent. This is about what I coined polyvagal parenting. What's polyvagal parenting? It's understanding these concepts from an embodied perspective, being a parent that is parenting from a trauma-informed lens. We talk about becoming a conscious parent, Dr. Shafali. Everyone's like, I want to be a conscious parent. I want to be a conscious parent. I want to be a conscious parent. And what that's doing, unwittingly creating a generation of parents that are trying to now be conscious parents as like, look at me, I'm a conscious parent. Where conscious parenting isn't a grandiose title. It's about the relationship that you're having with a child. It's about creating relationships with the child, not just like, look at me, I'm such a fucking great parent, which making it about me, which is the opposite of a conscious parent. It's about the relationship. And that's what polyvagal parenting is. And I tell you, I've just been being it. As I've been doing my own healing work, naturally that's been passing on to the way that I parent my child. And the results have been staggering. I mean, I don't want to, Dominic, you're going to watch this in 20 years. And I'm just going to say, I'm proud of you already. I know you're going to do amazing things because you have such an empathetic heart. You know how to regulate your emotions already. You know that you're safe with your mom and dad. It's limitless what you can do. And so you're full of joy and playfulness. And so my intention as I'm speaking to your 30 years self is to make sure that you have everything set up, that I become exactly who I need to be so that you can be limitless. And that's really what polyvagal parenting is. And if this conversation is really landing for you and you're really curious, it's Friday, April the 19th from 4 to 7. It's a 3-hour workshop and it's only $30. If you're watching the replay, I'm sure there's going to be I'll put a link in the show notes for you to catch the replay of it. It's 3 hours. And I break down the polyvagal theory and how it lands with your parenting, basically parenting from a somatic lens. One of the principles of it being that you're not responsible, and this kind of touches on viewing the child as an extension of yourself. I wish someone told my parents that they aren't responsible for who I'm being, but they're responsible for how they respond to me, who I'm being. That's a huge distinction of becoming a polyvagal parent. We're not responsible for who they are. We're responsible for how we respond to who they are. And that distinction separates the enmeshment and it breaks the cycle. And this is what I'm so freaking stoked to teach for the very first time. From the lens of a parent who's learning as I go. And what I've learned is staggering. Everyone in our community that I bring this up with, they're just like, wow, their relationships with their children are completely changing. We've had 2 people in our community this week heal a massive, more than 1 year rupture with their teenage children. 2 moms healing these ruptures with their teenage children simply by embodying what I'm about to teach in this workshop. I am super delighted. It is only $30 and it's for everybody who really, if you're a child and you want to help make sense of your parents and where they might have dropped the ball, if you don't have kids, or if you're a parent, if you've been a child, you're an adult who had parents and you want to learn how to make sense of it, or if you're a parent and you really want to create an amazing experience and you're noticing your kids got some behavioral issues, tantrums, struggles with anxiety, this is exactly for you. So I really look forward to sharing it. Something I'm really passionate about, as you can tell. And send me a DM. Let me know how this episode landed for you, any questions that you have. This work is what I'm dedicating my life to, and speaking to people who are willing to raise their hand and say, it didn't start with me. but it can end with me. If that sounds like you, keep tuning in because I got some more really cool stuff coming your way. See you at the next perfect time.